Solve linear equations by graphing. After watching this video, I will be able to solve linear equations or linear functions by graphing. So we talked about linear equations, and linear functions is basically the same idea. And that's where the graph turns out to be a line. So the simplest linear function is f of x equals x or y equals x. Remember, f of x is the same thing as y. And this is basically known as a parent function, meaning there's a family of graphs, and that's basically where a group of graphs with one or more similar characteristics. So because lines are very similar, we can have a whole bunch of lines which are being stressed or compressed. Doesn't really matter, and it's all falling under the same characteristics of a linear function graph. So when we actually graph equations on a graph, we can actually solve them. So it's not necessary to actually solve for x. If you can graph it, then you'll know what the answers will be. And this is known as a root. The root is basically what would make the equation true. So a linear equation, because it's just one line, will only have one root. And you can find the root of an equation by graphing its function. Then we also can call the values of x wherever they equal 0, and those are called zeros of the function. The zero of a function is located at the x-intercept. So whenever you see a graph that has an x-intercept, then that's the zero, or what would be the number that would make the equation equal 0. So this is a lot of just like terminology or vocabulary that we can use when we're talking about linear functions. So if I'm told the x-intercept and the y-intercept, I can graph the line easily without using a table of values. So x-intercept would mean that my line is crossing the x-axis at -4. So I'm going to plot a point at -4. And then my y-intercept is -3, so that's my y-axis at -3. And then hopefully using a ruler or a straight edge, I'm going to connect my dots. And this is a sketch, meaning it's not completely accurate because I am doing this freehand of my graph. If I was using some technology like you are on Edulastic, then when you plot the 2 points, your line is going to be super straight. So this means that the actual zero of this function would be -4 because that is the x-intercept. If I want to give the coordinates of each point, my x-intercept, which was in red, is going to be -4, 0. And then my y-intercept is going to be 0, -3. Now, what makes this problem a little more challenging is I am not told the x or y-intercept, so I cannot graph it. So in order to find the x and y-intercept, I need to replace one of the other letters with a 0. So for example, if I'm trying to find the x-intercept, I'm going to replace the letter y with 0 and then vice versa with x. So I'm going to take my equation 3x minus 2y equals 12 and replace the letter y with the number 0. So then I solve for x equals 4. So this means that my x-intercept would be 4, 0. Now I'm going to do the same thing to find the y-intercept, but this time I'm going to let x equal 0. So I took my equation 3x minus 2y equals 12, and this time I replaced the letter x with 0, and I solved for y, and that gave me y equals -6, so my y-intercept was 0, -6. Now I can plot the 2 points, the x-intercept and the y-intercept, to graph this line. So once you know what the x and y-intercept is, you can just do the same thing we did in our previous example, plot the points, and graph your line. Because it can be a little challenging to find your x and y intercepts, we're going to do a practice example where you should try and use a previous example to try and find the x-intercept on your own. Pause your video while you're trying to do this, and then press play to see if you got your answer correct. So you can pause your video now. So to find the x-intercept, you have to replace the letter y with 0 and solve for x. In this case, I did not get a nice whole number. I got x equals 8/3, and that's the same thing as 2.67 approximately. You should make sure to read the instructions on your assignment when you're completing them. If you're completing on Edulastic, it will tell you whether it would be an improper fraction or to leave it as a decimal. So I'm going to leave it as an improper fraction. And this is the x-coordinate, or the x-intercept, 8/3. So that's by the 2, a little bit more than 2, about a little bit more than halfway. So I'm just going to estimate around halfway for your x-intercept. So now we're going to do the same thing to find the y-intercept, but replace the letter x with 0. In this case, my y-intercept, my y equals -4, so my y-intercept is 0, -4. So I can plot my point as 0, -4. And now with my x and y-intercept, I can connect the dots to sketch the graph of this linear function.